Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Margaret Plantagenet Pole. Traitor number 3 in Margaret's life, her brother Edward. Though likely innocent of the charges, so much for a gentler world, they did not get the Simnel treatment. There were rumors that Edward was set up to be executed. The marriage between King Henry and Queen Elizabeth's oldest son was being discussed with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's youngest daughter, Catherine. You've probably heard of them. They were the ones who kept fighting the Muslims on behalf of the Catholic Church. They were very Catholic, and they would fight you to prove it. Crusading was their favorite hobby. They were uncomfortable sending their daughter to marry a prince who could be displaced so easily by a popular York claimant. It is possible that Edward executed these men so that this powerful marriage alliance could take place. It was also rumored that Catherine suspected her parents of this and actually felt guilty about the death of Margaret's brother. Margaret was now the last living member of her immediate family, having lost both of her parents and all of her siblings. She's sometimes called the last Plantagenet because she was the last member of the royal family to survive. Margaret's husband, Richard Pole, held various offices in King Henry VII's government, the highest being Chamberlain for Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's eldest son, and heir to the throne. So the pandering seemed to be working. This king, he liked a good pander. He strikes me as the, I don't want to kill you, but I will, so don't give me any reason to, no matter how small, kind of guy. It had to be so stressful for Margaret to navigate this world. She had been trying to navigate the man drama surrounding her since birth. Let's not forget that her grandfather was Warwick, and her father was the ever-dramatic, always picking the losing side, George, Duke of Clarence. Like her mother Isabel, she was just a pawn in the games of the men around her. Margaret had her third son a couple of years later in 1501. This little boy was named Geoffrey. I know what you're thinking. Where did Geoffrey come from? What were they trying to signal with that? Geoffrey was also the name of Margaret's father-in-law. They were having boys faster than the royal couple was having boys, and they were running out of names to copy. So they named the baby after Margaret's father-in-law, who was also, through marriage, related to the king's mother, so the pandering hadn't traveled too far. When the king's oldest son, Arthur, married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret became one of her ladies-in-waiting, living with them out in Wales. This could have been awkward. We don't know exactly how Margaret felt about this, but Catherine felt guilty about the death of Margaret's brother. It seemed, though, that Margaret didn't blame her. She became very close to the princess and her future daughter Mary. Her entourage was dissolved when Arthur died in 1502, age 15. Margaret, at this point, was 29. In 1504, when Margaret was 31, she had her fifth and final baby, a little girl named Ursula, probably after her sister-in-law. When her husband died the next year, Margaret became a widow with 5 children. She had a small estate of land inherited from her husband, but no other income or prospects. Her mother had been raised by the richest man in England. She had been raised by royal dukes and then kings, but now she was poor. Henry VII paid for Richard's funeral to ease the situation. Margaret devoted her son, Reginald Pole, to the church. He was just a little boy, but he was going to have an eventful career as a papal legate, Archbishop of Canterbury, and later a cardinal. But later, when he was older, when he was an adult, when he was that grown cardinal, he bitterly resented his mother for abandoning him. After her husband's death, though, Margaret had such inadequate means to support herself and her children that she was forced to live in an abbey as a guest of the Brigittine nuns. She remained there until she returned to favor when Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509. When King Henry VII died, his 17-year-old only surviving son Henry became King Henry VIII. The king is dead. Long live the king. Catherine of Aragon was still in England after the death of her husband, Prince Arthur. There had been some drama about whether or not to return her and her dowry to her parents, but nothing had really moved in all this time. But now that Prince Henry was King Henry VIII, he was going to get married, and he was going to marry Catherine of Aragon because he was the king, and it was a king's prerogative, even if the king is only 17 years old. But stay tuned. This will create far more drama than it caused originally. We'll talk about that in Catherine of Aragon's episode next week. Margaret was again appointed as one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, just as she had been when Catherine had been married to Arthur. In 1512, an Act of Parliament restored Margaret to the earldom of Salisbury, and some of her brother's land in which had belonged to it, for which she paid 5,000 marks, equivalent to about £2 million in current money. Henry VII had controlled them first while her brother was a minor and then during his imprisonment. He later confiscated them after his trial, as one does when you're the king and you feel like someone betrayed you. As Countess of Salisbury, Margaret managed her lands well. By 1538, she became the fifth richest noble in England. Not the wife of the fifth richest noble. She was the fifth richest noble on her own in England. Her first son, Henry Pole, was created Baron of Montague, another of the Neville titles, speaking for the family in the House of Lords. Her second son, Arthur Pole, had a generally successful career as a courtier, becoming one of the 6 gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, the 6 closest male friends to the king, his inner circle. In 1520, Margaret was appointed governess to Henry's daughter Mary, the future Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary, depending on who you ask. But for now, she was a 4-year-old Tudor princess. The next year, Margaret's sons got mixed up with Buckingham's plot. She left favor again, but she was back just 4 years later, again as Mary's nanny. But when Mary was declared a bastard in 1533, Margaret refused to give Mary's gold plate and jewels back to Henry, saying that they belonged to the princess. Mary's household was broken up at the end of the year, and Margaret asked if she could serve Mary as governess at her own cost. She was just going to take her in, because she had raised her. But this was not permitted. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, suggested 2 years later that Mary be handed over to Margaret. Allow her to live. You don't want her. She loves Margaret. Let her live with Margaret. But Henry refused, calling her a fool of no experience. This was the beginning of the dark years for King Henry VIII. He was about to start beheading wives. We will get into King Henry a lot over the next 6 episodes, and then even more later, because he had 6 wives and 2 daughters that were all queens. But Henry was acting increasingly unstable. There was a plot named the Exeter Conspiracy. It was supposedly a plot to have King Henry VIII deposed. He had left the Catholic Church, not just for him, but for everyone in his country, for all of England. It was illegal to be Catholic now in England. And the English had been Catholic for hundreds of years, so this was a bit of a culture shock. One of the men most upset with King Henry was Margaret's son, Reginald. Remember him? He was the 3rd son, the one she dedicated to God when she couldn't afford to care for him anymore. He was made a cardinal, and now the Pope wanted him to organize a protest about the religious changes in England. The 4th traitor in Margaret's life, her son, Reginald, Cardinal Pole. The Catholic protest was called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Northern England wanted to be Catholic, and they wanted the king to know that they wanted to be Catholic. He had been decommissioning abbots and monasteries and priories all over Northern England, and they were not happy with it. He had just beheaded a wife, and he wasn't about to start being the good guy. Many hangings of Catholics ensued over Northern England. Hundreds of Catholics were put to death because of this protest. Her other son got caught corresponding with his brother, who was Catholic clergy. After all, he was raised by the church. What else was he going to be? Margaret wrote to her son admonishing him and pleading with him to be loyal to the king. But the king was no longer Catholic, and Margaret had given her son to the church. He was now cardinal and very, very Catholic. He was not going to support the king, his second cousin. Margaret was away from court, but during this time the king had divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and beheaded his second wife, Anne Boleyn. He had moved on to his third wife, Jane Seymour, and Jane had only lived a year into that marriage. She died in 1537, giving birth to King Henry's only legitimate son. The king was in a bad way, broken-hearted and devastated at the loss of the only wife he loved. His council was now in charge, and the king was eating his way into a deep, deep depression. Margaret's other son, Geoffrey, was arrested and questioned, probably along with torture. The fifth traitor in Margaret's life, her son, Sir Geoffrey Pole, a knight. He admitted that there were plans for him to marry the former Princess Mary and depose her father, King Henry VIII. He also said that it was his eldest brother Henry and his mother Margaret that were the Catholics involved with the Pilgrimage of Grace plot. Margaret and Henry were arrested in November 1538, along with Henry's son Henry, still a child. In January 1539, Geoffrey was pardoned, but his brother Henry was executed for treason after a trial. The sixth traitor in Margaret's life, her son Henry, Baron Montague. In May 1539, Henry, Margaret, and others were attainted, just as Margaret's father George had been. Their lands were taken, their titles were taken, their money was taken, all by the crown. This conviction meant that they lost everything. Mostly, coincidentally, land in southern England, which would be the prime spot to attack. They were likely just had their lands taken so that they couldn't aid someone wanting to attack England. They weren't trusted. Geoffrey so regretted turning his mother and brother in that he attempted to end his own life unsuccessfully. He stabbed himself in the chest with a dull knife. Seems like something that would have worked in the 16th century, but it didn't. He survived. And he attempted suicide a second time, this time trying to suffocate himself with a cushion. But this too was unsuccessful. As part of the evidence for the Bill of Attainder, Cromwell produced a tunic bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, symbolizing Margaret's support for the Church of Rome and rule of her son Reginald, and support for the king's Roman Catholic daughter Mary. It was found 6 months after her house and effect were searched for things at her arrest. Just 6 months later, they were like, hey, look, we found this other thing. It was there. We just missed it. It was likely a fabrication. She was sentenced to death and to be executed at the king's will. The 7th traitor in Margaret's life? Margaret herself. As she was now styled, Margaret Pole. Not Margaret Plantagenet, not Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, just regular old Margaret Pole. And she was held in the Tower of London for 2.5 years. She and her grandson Henry, the son of her son, were held together and supported by the king. Supported is in air quotes because they were in prison. Babies in prison. I just can't. But it was a nice prison. She was attended by servants and received an extensive grant of clothing in March 1541, probably by the now Queen of England, the king's 5th wife, Catherine Howard. Part of the clothing she was sent was a fur bathrobe and fur slippers. The Tower was a very cold place, and the Queen was donating clothing to her husband's older, poor relations. Like family before them, she was in prison, but it was a nice prison. If what you are thinking is that Henry went from his 3rd wife, Jane, to his 5th wife, Catherine, there was a 4th wife in there that came and went pretty fast, named Anne. The king was going through wives pretty quickly at this point. And it wasn't really Margaret's priority, so it doesn't get a lot of notice in her episode. Henry had been married to his first wife for 20 years, and his other 5 marriages last a combined 14 years. It's hard to keep up with all of them, but they will all have their own episodes, so if you're interested, come back. The following poem was carved on the wall of Margaret's cell. For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, Margaret was told that she was to die within an hour. She answered that she didn't know of a crime that she had committed. Nevertheless, she was taken from her cell to the precincts of the Tower of London, where a low wooden block had been prepared instead of the customary scaffold. It seems like she was being executed in a hurry. Chapuis wrote, "At first, when the sentence of death was made known to her, she found the thing very strange, not knowing of what crime she was accused, nor how she had been sentenced." Because the main executioner had been sent north to deal with rebels, the execution was performed by, quote, "a wretched and blundering youth who hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner." End quote. She was executed at the age of 67. Her son, Reginald Pole, said that he would never fear to call himself the son of a martyr. She was later regarded by the Catholics as such, the Blessed Margaret Plantagenet. And this is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Margaret Plantagenet Pole? She survived surprisingly well for all of the turmoil in her life. Her father was executed by her uncle. Her cousins were likely executed by her other uncle. Her brother was executed by her cousin's husband, and she was executed by that same cousin's son. The Plantagenet women had a hard time in the Tudor world. I can't imagine having to give up my child to a church because I couldn't afford to keep him. Do you think she stayed Catholic or became Protestant? The evidence against her was probably fabricated, but she had been Catholic her entire life. And the plot to depose Henry wanted to put his daughter Mary on the throne, and she was very close to Mary and her mother. They were staunch Catholics. She had quite the roller coaster of a life. Born the daughter of a royal duke, raised by a king and queen, married to a knight, thrust into poverty, then rich again, then destitute, then executed. It seemed like her 67 years were spent jumping from one scary trauma to another. King Henry VIII would soon move on to his sixth and final wife, but we'll get into that later. You have 6 weeks of the wives of King Henry VIII coming up. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye. This is post-production me, and forgive the sound quality. I have a little bit of a cold, but I just wanted to add this at the end to say, please, 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 don't come for me, Richard III Society. I know, we don't know why those boys went missing, why they're missing, if they went, they're dead now, because this was hundreds of years ago, but we don't know what happened, and I'm aware that Shakespeare worked for the Tudors, and he was pandering to the boss. Richard III may have been a great, great fellow. Also, he was the one who was supposed to be keeping them safe, and he declared them illegitimate, which is kind of a rude move for your nephews, and then put them in prison, but I don't mean anything by it, so please, Richard III Society, don't come for me. I get it. We don't know. I'm wondering just like everyone else.